G'day Grow Street leaders and welcome to term 3. We're looking at the books of Job and Jonah. We're doing 7 weeks in Job, 7 studies, and then we're going to finish the term 3 weeks in Jonah, 2 studies with a social. Now you've probably already been to Grow Street Leaders launch before you've watched this video, but it is the first video of the first study, and so I should probably give a few minutes to Job by way of introduction. I'll try to do it in 5-6 minutes or so. Then we'll look at the content and what we can't miss from the first 2 chapters, which is what we're looking at week 1. And then we'll look very briefly at the study itself. And so, the book of Job by way of introduction, here we go. Is it a book about suffering? Suffering's a big theme. There's a lot of personal suffering from Job in it. There's a lot of wrestle with the idea of suffering. There's the constant question that Job and his friends are trying to figure out: why am I suffering? Why is this suffering happening to Job? But all of this is actually just content for the author to use for the real point of the book. The real focus of the book is God's justice. The book, the technical term for what the book's doing is it's a theodicy. It's a defense of God in his justice, particularly as to how can God be just and allow suffering to happen in his world. And so the big point of the book isn't answering the question, why is Job suffering? But rather, the big climax of the book is, is God just in this? And the big points that get made is that only God can be God. God's world and these things that they're trying to wrestle with are far too complex for any human to understand. God is in control, so trust God. He's in control, he's just, he's good, just trust God. And so that leads us to the literary form of the book. It's wisdom literature is what we're dealing with. And so there are these ideas that are circled around exploring the limits of the knowledge that these characters have, and trying to answer the question of is God just when there's so much suffering in his world which he is sovereign over. The structure of the book, it's a big book, 42 chapters. Broadly, the first 2 chapters are introduction to Job and the suffering that happens. We get these heavenly scenes which give us special insight into why these things are happening. Chapter 3 is a bit of a standalone, Job's just emotional expression of how devastating this suffering has been on him, which sets us up for the bulk of the book, which is a dialogue between Job and his friends about trying to figure out why he's suffering. So it's chapters 4 all the way through to 37. And in these chapters, there's 4 sections. There's 3 cycles of speeches between Job and his friends. So Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar are the 3 friends, and Job. So one of them will speak, Job will respond. One of them will speak, Job will respond. There's a cycle. Another cycle happens. Another cycle happens. And then right at the end, from chapters 32 to 37, we get this guy called Elihu come in and give 4 speeches right at the end. So it's 3 cycles, chapters 4 to 14, chapters 15 to 21, chapters 22 to 31, and then Elihu 32 to 37. And we'll look at that actually in the study itself. We'll break it up that way and look at it as a group. Then we finally have the climax of the book, which is God's response. He's been silent for 37 chapters as they've been battling this out, and finally he speaks for 3 chapters, 2 speeches to Job. And then we have Job's responses all the way up to the beginning of chapter 42. Those first few verses is Job's final response to God in humility. And then we have just the winding down, the ending of the story at the end of chapter 42. So there's the big structure. How do we read the book of Job? 4 ways: as wisdom, as poetry, as narrative, as Christians. First, as wisdom. I've already mentioned this is a wisdom literature book. It's not concerned with the kind of the salvation history so much of the Bible, like we might experience Genesis, Exodus, like that. It's not like a letter that we've just come out of in 2 Corinthians. It's not full of propositions and argument that we piece together, and it's in sentences and paragraphs. But they're ideas that are circled around exploring the limits of the knowledge of what's going on. So that's wisdom. As poetry, it's not prose. Again, it's not sentences and paragraphs. They're ideas expressed in a more artistic way, which engage emotion, that they're more expressive. They make you feel things, which communicates meaning. And so you've got to throw yourself back to late high school, where you're analysing poetry for imagery, for repetition, for the rhythm, the feeling of the whole section, any parallelism that helps you explain any one section, and just the form itself, the length. The length of poetry communicates meaning, which is very significant for Job, because a lot of what Job's friends could be summarized in a few words, but no, the author doesn't do that. He draws it out in these massive slabs of speech. What effect does that have on us, and how does that communicate the meaning that the author's trying to convey? They're the kinds of poetry questions you need to ask. Third, as narrative. This is a story with a beginning, a complication, a quest to try and resolve it, a final resolution in God's response, and then kind of the ending situation, like any movie might have, that you could think of. I almost gave an illustration, but I haven't got time. So you ask questions like, why has the author done this? Like, it's just helpful to go, yeah, there's an author behind this narrative that's trying to communicate meaning to us by what he does and doesn't say. What is the author saying about the characters? How should we view the characters? Does the author want us to listen to this character, or think that this character's dumb and they haven't quite got it? The length of speeches is the thing. What does the narrator himself say? What key insights does he give to us, and how does that shape the way we understand each individual part? They're all really important things to ask as narrative. Finally, as Christians, the Old Testament is a Christian book. It's for us. It's God's living and active word speaking to us today. And so how does Job and the book of Job foreshadow Jesus, foreshadow the gospel? How is Job like Jesus? How is Job not like Jesus? These are the kinds of questions. How is Job like us as Christians? How is Job not like us? How does the gospel and our worldview as Christians actually give us different understanding or a better hope than Job himself has? It is appropriate to ask, what can we learn from Job? We're going to be doing that a lot. You might remember this from Ruth as well, that we did last year. And that's because these particular characters in the Old Testament are held up as examples for us to learn from and follow. So in James 5:11, Job is lifted up as an example of perseverance through suffering. And so be like Job. And so we want to ask, how can we be like Job? What can we learn from him? They're the kinds of questions that we ask as Christians of the text. All right, let's move to chapters 1 and 2 themselves. Quick content. In the first 5 verses, we have the beginning of the story, the introduction of Job, what he's like, some key details about him. Then we have verses 6 to 12, a heavenly scene, the first heavenly scene, which is very interesting, but kind of gives us special insight into where this whole story comes from. Then verse 13 to 22 is what happens as a result of that heavenly scene. It's the external suffering that Job experiences, his first test. Chapter 2 gives us the second heavenly scene, and then the verses following, verses 7 to 10, are the outworking of that in a second challenge to Job, which is his internal suffering, stuff that happens to his own body, and the temptation that his wife actually brings to curse God. There's the content. There's a lot of good stuff to pick up in there. I wish we could spend more time even just on these 2 chapters, but here's 3 things that I reckon that we can't miss as we do this. We cannot miss that Job is righteous and blameless. It gets said 3 times The narrator says it in 1 verse 1. Man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Then in 1 verse 8, in the first heavenly scene, the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God. God says this of Job. And then again, 2 verse 3, in the second heavenly scene, God says it yet again of Job. Job is righteous and blameless. The narrator is repeating it for us by himself, by God, and under God's authority. We need to lock that piece in. It is not as a result of Job's sin, wickedness, that this suffering has come upon him. That is crystal clear, and we need to make sure it's crystal clear. Otherwise, the whole rest of the book won't make sense to us. We'll be lost in the confusion of Job and his friends if we miss this special insight from the heavenly scenes and from the narrator himself. That's the first thing. The second thing we can't miss is God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty is something that's just not questioned by anyone in the book. God is completely in control of the good and the bad. And particularly what we get from these two chapters, and interesting for us to just think on, is that God is sovereign over the spiritual realm and over suffering. So the spiritual realm is not this Greek mythology idea of the gods and contention among them and chaos in the spiritual realm. No. God is the uncontested head of the council, the spiritual council. He gives permissions, he gives limits to his own power and how that is affected into the world. He's completely in control of the spiritual realm and spiritual reality of this world and life that we live. Second, he's fully in control, sovereign over suffering. So in the heavenly scenes, you get this dialogue between a character called the Satan and God. And God says, you can go out and you can do these things to Job, but no further than these things. And off he goes and does it. But 1 verse 16, another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants. I'm the only one who escaped to tell you. The fire of God. So we get this interesting agency happening. The Chaldeans is another example of it. There's multiple causes to suffering, but God is ultimately in control, and he has a hand. His power. The fire of God fell from the heavens. He is involved in the cause of suffering, and that's something for us to wrestle in, which leads to the question, how is that okay? How is it okay that God is sovereign in control of this world, but there's suffering in his world? How can he still be good and just? That's the whole point of the book of Job. So if that's a question that comes up, great. You're in the perfect position to engage in the dialogue of the book of Job and prepare yourself for God's response, just as Job does. Third thing that we can't miss, and this is kind of an overlap of this chapter with chapter 3, is that suffering isn't trivial. I think we can look at Job's example and his responses in chapter 1 and 2, famous responses. Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I'll depart. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. He's a man who just lost his entire family and all of his possessions. He says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And then in chapter 2, when all this affliction happens to his own body, he says, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? This guy has just got the best example for us to follow. It's amazing. But a danger of it is that we go, the suffering mustn't have been that big a deal. It must be trivial. We need to think the same about our friends and family and our possessions. And there's a truth to that, but there's a real wrestle with suffering here for Job. Otherwise this book wouldn't exist in the length that it is. Don't mistake his response to treating life and suffering lightly. We see that in the final verses of this chapter. We won't do these verses in this study, but you can see that his suffering is so great that his friends can't even recognize him. They're speechless and just sit with him for days and days. And certainly chapter 3, which we'll come to next week, adds to this point significantly. You can't miss those things. That's what we really want to get from these 2 chapters. So let's come to the study. Big picture, there's a few parts. There's 3 parts. The first part is just looking at Job. What do we think of him? What does the author want us to think of him, know of him? And just recognize that problem, supposed problem, that Job is righteous, but he still experiences suffering. What do we make of that? How is that different to our world today? The second part, we're going to look at the 2 heavenly scenes and compare them. So there's a table on the final page for you to print off, cut it in half. There's 2 tables. Give that to your groups and split up. And we're just trying to observe what the accusation that the Satan brings against Job. How does that play out? And have you got any questions? That'll just be good to get people thinking and their heads into the passage. Then there's some questions at the end of that. Once you've pulled your groups back together about what we learn about God and what we learn about his involvement in Job's suffering. So there'll be some interesting discussion around there. And then part 3, we want to come back to Job and on to Jesus. So how does Job respond? What can we learn from that? We've talked about how that's a fine and good question for us to ask. But how does his suffering remind you of the gospel and of Jesus Christ? So this righteous and upright, innocent man suffers. How does that remind you of Jesus? Jesus is the ultimate righteous, blameless one who suffers. And he doesn't suffer for his own sin, he suffers for the sins of us, for the sins of many. And so hopefully some good gospel reflections, appreciation for Jesus in his suffering, his determination in that to save us. And that can lead into prayer. Now there is a note at the bottom of the study about the Satan. It's a question that no doubt will come up in group and people love to debate it. And there is all sorts of debate around it, but it's not a question, the specific identity of the Satan and how is he in the heavenly scene with God in his presence. They're not questions that the author's asking. And so we want to avoid, not completely avoid, but we just want to not make that the whole study when that's just not the point. It's not what the author wants us to ask. And so there's a quick note there to just point out a few things so that you can wrestle with those things yourself, help your group deal with it appropriately, but move on and get on to other things that the author is trying to help us see. A little bit of a longer video this week, a lot of intro, but I trust your time in Job will be very rewarding. It's a great book. I'm praying and hoping and trusting that your group loves getting into the book of Job. Go well.